Hello, I'm Alexandra Sotiriou, an economist at the Department of Planning and Regional Development at the University of Thessaly in Volos, Greece. I would like to welcome you to our ESSPIN Open Access online courses about inequality. ESSPIN is a research project funded by the European Commission Horizon Programme to study economic, social and spatial inequalities in Europe. Our research work has lasted for 3 years, and it was the outcome of the collective effort of 13 universities and research organizations. It is now almost over, and we would like to share with you some findings. I hope this will be useful. So let's start from the beginning. The topic of our course today is regional inequalities in the European Union. So the objectives of this topic are to understand what regional inequalities are. We will start with a definition. Then we will explore their evolution in Europe and the temporal trends. We will see the links to the theoretical frameworks that explain and predict the regional inequalities. And last but not least, we will review the empirical evidence and suggest some policy implications that come out of Work Package 1 from the ESSPIN Horizon project. So why do we study regional inequalities? Why do they matter? So first of all, there is an important dichotomy, which is economic efficiency and aggregate growth, and the social cohesion and fairness on the other hand. So when we want to look at social cohesion and fairness, it's not enough to look at the macroeconomic trends and the national level aggregate growth, but we need to look at the subnational disparities in income and growth. This is important for the political stability and trust in the EU integration process. So key concepts that we want to clarify here. Regional inequalities and how are they measured? What do we measure when we look at regional inequalities? We do that because it's important to look at the convergence and divergence trends over time. This is important to see if cohesion in the EU has been achieved and if development gaps are reduced over time as a result of deeper integration and as a result of successful EU cohesion policies. So let's start with the definition. What are regional inequalities? When we talk about regional inequalities, we mean differences in income, economic development, growth, productivity, employment, the quality of infrastructure, the quality of life between regions and across space. So subnationally, we may look at various spatial scales, the NUTS 2, the NUTS 3, city level or neighborhood level. This depends on the availability of data for the unit of analysis that we want to examine. So let's look at the dimensions of regional inequality. When we discuss about inequality, we can approach this question by looking at the economic outcomes, which are measured by looking at GDP growth or productivity growth. Another important dimension, of course, is the social dimension, which we proxy by looking at the unemployment rates and the poverty rates. Also very important is the degree of accessibility, transport infrastructure, connectivity, differences in broadband access, and very importantly, the institutional and environmental gaps across regions and across countries, of course. This is very important because it's a driver of economic prospect, of economic growth trajectories. So let's look at some indicators. Some indicators to measure regional inequalities is the GDP per capita at the regional level, GVA per worker in order to look at the productivity trends, unemployment rates, risk of poverty, and very importantly, the composite indices, which are socioeconomic aspects measured for another larger variety of socioeconomic outcomes, which are related to health, education, etc. So measuring inequality, how do we go about actually measuring inequality? So we can use sigma convergence, which basically looks at the dispersion of GDP across regions, how far apart economic growth and development is across regions, how large the gaps are. Beta convergence, which looks at the catch-up speed. So beta convergence is about how fast the poorer regions or countries grow with respect to the richer regions, to see if there is over time a catch-up process. Lastly, we have the Gini and the Thale indices for regional income inequality measures. So let's look at the spatial depiction of regional inequalities at the NUTS2 level in the EU. So here we have the spatial variation of GDP per capita in purchasing power standards as a percentage of the EU average. The darker colors depict regions with GDP per capita above the EU average, whereas the lighter purple colors and then the lighter pale pink and the darker purple colors depict the poorer regions. Here, as we can observe, there is a rich core and a poorer periphery. Over time, regional inequalities have at a quite a large extent persisted subnationally. Although we have national convergence over time, there is regional divergence at the subnational level. So let's look at another indicator, which is unemployment. So how do regional disparities in unemployment evolve across space? We can see on the left side the map of unemployment at the NUTS2 level. This is unemployment rate as a share of the labor force at the NUTS2 level. Here we can see that the EU South has the highest rates of youth unemployment, whereas the core and the northern countries and regions exhibit lower rates. So here we can see that actually the regional disparities in GDP hide behind structural disparities in other dimensions of inequality. For example, as we can see here, unemployment. So on the right side, we have the regions with the highest unemployment in the EU and the lowest. So the highest unemployment in 2020 was in Ceuta in Spain, followed by Thessaly and central Greece in Greece. The regions of Thessaly and central Greece, while the lowest unemployment rates were measured in central Bohemia in Czech Republic. So this is a quick indication of the large discrepancies, the large disparities in other variables, for example, unemployment. So, looking at the convergence in the EU and the temporal trend in convergence, regional inequalities over time in this graph are depicted in the blue line that shows the coefficient of variation from 1999 to 2015. We can see by looking at the blue line that there is convergence up until 2008. Actually, there is a stagnation from 2006 to 2009, and then an increase of inequalities from 2008 onwards, which is attributed in part to the consequences of the global financial crisis. In 2015, convergence reaches the 2000 level, so we can say that in the course of these last years, we do not have an improvement of convergence. Actually, we have an increase, and then we basically reach the initial point. So a couple of words on the theoretical framework. Regional inequalities are explained and predicted by both the neoclassical theory and the new economic geography. So neoclassical theory initially attributing to factor mobility and diminishing returns to scale predicted that in the long run, convergence will take place automatically if markets work well. However, it failed to explain the large divergence at the regional level that has been observed in the past decades. The new economic geography, on the other hand, by discussing the important effect of agglomeration economies, market access, the forces of cumulative causation and path dependency, and the initial conditions, the importance of increasing returns to scale, increasing returns to education, and the increasing returns to the accumulation of skills leads in the long run to divergence. So new economic geography is more aligned with the observed trends. In general, what we can say at this point is that the geography of inequality manifests in a richer core in the northwestern European regions and countries versus the periphery, which is the south and eastern European countries and regions. There are important urban-rural divides, both in core and periphery countries, and of course, the challenges that emerge from coastal versus inland regions in terms of catching up and converging to the EU average. So, place-based approaches that have been developed to inform policy making have been discussed in the famous Barca report, which emphasizes territorial capital and the unique assets of each space, and calls for tailored place-based policies to unlock growth in lagging regions, when the automatic process of convergence, of course, fail. An example of this would be boosting rural innovation and cross-border cooperation through targeted EU cohesion programs to stimulate growth in more peripheral regions. So, to wrap up some stylized facts, what we have seen so far is that there was important trends in convergence, especially at the national level in the 80s and the 90s. Then there are divergence trends after 2008, as we saw in the diagram before, and the polarization in terms of capital versus the periphery at the subnational level. So economic activity and wealth are increasingly concentrated in specific areas within countries, and this is a huge challenge for the EU integration process and the EU cohesion policy. Main beneficiaries are large metropolis and urban agglomerations because they attract growing shares of wealth, economic activity, and skilled labor. And this is a continuing cumulative process. Examples are London and Paris, similar to New York and Tokyo. At a lower level, secondary cities like Brussels and Amsterdam play the same role. So these emerging global city networks where functional links across the world extend beyond physical proximity can amplify the divergence trends we observe. So some conclusions. Over the past 15 years, income convergence has occurred in the EU overall, both between countries and regions in certain time periods, thanks to the faster growth in poorer areas, which is measured by the beta convergence indicator, and the reduction in GDP per capita gaps. Yet, strong internal divergence remains because there are geographical clusters that are created from the EU enlargement waves and the EU widening and deepening of the integration process. So Central and Eastern Europe have led convergence while southern regions have fallen behind the EU average. However, this convergence that is observed at the national level hides within country gaps. More specifically, in Central and Eastern Europe, capital cities drive this national convergence process by growing much faster than the rest of their territories within their respective countries. The persistence of these divides raises questions about whether they stem from temporary crises or deeper structural factors or failure of policies. How can we explain these diverging patterns within countries and across geographical clusters? Are they simply temporary, or should they be attributed to country-specific structural features or the uneven benefits of deeper EU integration? And for this last question, we have empirical evidence to provide by discussing the recently published paper, The Geography of Integration and Regional Growth in the EU, which is the product of work package 1 of the Horizon ESSPIN project. So this paper, which was published in the Journal of Regional Studies, looks at how the geographical breakdown of trade relations in the EU by looking specifically at trading with core versus peripheral partners, plays a decisive role in determining regional growth trajectories. So, the research question and the underlying hypothesis for this analysis is that trade integration among similar income partners is expected to have more balanced effects on growth. Both parties win in a sense. However, when trade among partners with different levels of development may have unbalanced or destructive effects for the peripheral regions due to import competition pressures. When a poorer region trades with a more advanced country, that's when import competition may play a destructive role for the poorer regions. So who trades with whom matters for regional growth. In order to empirically investigate this hypothesis, we use a sample of EU 27 regions at the NUTS2 EU level for a time period of 8 years using panel econometric models. So very quickly, the estimation equation is the following, which looks at the effect of integration, trade integration, on regional GDP growth. We look at the level of integration for 3 different sets of regions. So for the overall EU, for the entire EU sample of regions, and then for 2 subsets, the peripheral regions and the core regions. And we look at how the peripheral regions trade with more developed countries and with less developed countries. So we look at these 2 different sets of trade exposure and how the effects on regional growth differ from how the effects on growth depend on the type of trade integration. So here we have some empirical results. The first 3 columns show that when we look at the entire EU sample, there is a positive effect of trade integration on growth. However, when we look at the unbalanced trade between peripheral regions trading with the more developed EU countries, the statistical significance and sign is negative, which means that more trade with more developed EU countries is actually destructive for the growth of peripheral regions due to competition and import penetration pressures, and so weaker export capacities for the peripheral regions trading with the EU core countries. However, looking at the 3 last columns, we see that when the periphery trades with the periphery, so when the trade relations are of a more balanced type, there are mutually beneficial growth effects, as the sign suggests, which is positive and statistically significant. The same holds for when we look at services, so trade in services, when the periphery trades with more developed EU countries, but not looking at the products, but looking at the trade in services, there is a positive and statistically significant effect on growth, which means that services works in a sense like a transmission channel of new knowledge and technology for the production base of peripheral regions. So, some general conclusions. The European landscape is characterized by patterns of regional integration that are not always growth conducive for the peripheral regions, and as a result do not support the goal of cohesion and inclusive growth. So it's very important to zoom into the peripheral and subnational level in order to look at what drives the observed divergence. Trade integration at the EU level appears to have a positive effect on growth, as a variety of regions trade with each other in an overall balanced way. However, trade integration has a negative impact on the growth in weaker regions, as it is dominated by unbalanced trade relations, as we showed before looking at the empirical evidence. These unbalanced trade relations are responsible for imported structural pressures in the capital-intensive tradable sectors of the peripheral regions that need upgrade in order to be able to compete in the EU common market. So on the other hand, trade integration among peripheral regions So trade relations of a more balanced type have a positive impact, as trade relations are dominated by low to medium technology sectors. So there are lower import competition pressures and higher opportunities for exports. So in general, chronic gaps in human, physical, and financial capital shape a geography of opportunities and challenges that seem to be unfavorable for peripheral regions if left undetected and unaddressed. This may have to be the starting point for discussions about the future of the European cohesion policy. Thank you very much for your attention, and this course is available in the following ESSPIN Horizon project website.